on that, I wanted to point out something else in the Torah portion. And it's chapter 32, verse 33. Actually, it starts in verse 32. 32. It says the son, and it's talking about Jacob after he's wrestled with the angel all night, and the angel has knocked his hip out of socket. It says the sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping on his hip. That is why the children of Israel to this day do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. To me, this clears up a lot of questions. And I believe I included this as one example in the Becky booklet called Truth, Tradition, or Tear, where we're looking at certain traditions and trying to deal with the very fashionable doctrine of if it's not in the Torah, it's not truth. If it's not in the Torah, then it's man tradition, and I want no part of it. That is an oversimplification. It's called a logical fallacy. And in the booklet, I give you many examples of how both Yeshua and the apostles, not to mention many others, did practice man's tradition, and it was not condemned. We tend to focus on the things that were. So we look at those things, but we also look at the instances where they did practice man's tradition. And the key of doing that was to show that some traditions can grow out of the Torah, because the Torah itself is the seed. Yeshua gave the parable of the seed. The seed is the word. So you should be growing something out of the seed. What you shouldn't be growing something out of is a tear, a weed that looks like a seed. That's the difference. And because people don't always peel it back to the seed, they oversimplify and simply throw every man's tradition out into the backyard. And if you do that, then you're going to lose the ability to understand long passages of the Brit Chadashah, especially the book of Revelation. If you have trouble with man's tradition, then parts of Revelation are going to be nonsensical because they're almost verbatim out of the synagogue services for the high holy days. Everything that you would know probably about the gathering, the resurrection, the greater body of Messiah, the seed of it is in the Torah, but the details are in Jewish tradition. That's where you find them. And the beautiful thing is in this Torah portion, there's a hint embedded. And this hint is that a tradition developed around this particular narrative. Now, it doesn't say it's a commandment. It's simply recorded in the Torah, and it tells you that to commemorate this event, in order not to lose the memory of this event, because why is this event important? Because it's where Israel becomes Israel. And if you identify with Israel, then this is kind of your birthplace. This is where your name is born in the Torah. So it is a hugely significant event. It's a yeehaw moment. But it's identified with something that, okay, the angel knocked Jacob's hip out of socket during the struggle. Well, that's our story too, because we also strive with the Holy One. We strive with his will for us. We strive with the tests that he places before us. In fact, this is Jacob's gripe. He's saying, you promised me if I would come back that you would deal bountifully with me in this land, and I have come back, and now Esau is coming at me with 400 armed men. And I've got my family here. I've got my wives, I've got my children, I've got my livestock, I've got everything that I earned with blood, sweat, and tears, with Lavan changing my wages 10 times and sleeping out in the rain and the snow with nowhere to go. And here I am, and it looks like you're about to let me get killed. I trusted you. And it says he was greatly frightened. And like I told the morning class, Jacob had to do what Grandma Sarah did. She had to confront her greatest fear. Now Jacob has to confront his, which is meeting up with Esau, who had vowed to kill him as soon as their parents were dead. And now Esau is on the march with 400 men. So Jacob at this point had to confront his fear. But in confronting his fear, Jacob, Yaakov, becomes Yisrael. He becomes a nation. And so he has even more of an advantage than Abraham and Isaac. Abraham and Isaac were Abraham and Isaac. But in Jacob, in the third generation, Israel resurrects from the seed. Remember, it says he sows light like seed for the righteous. Abraham was counted as righteous, and then Isaac after him. And now with Jacob in the third generation, there is going to be a gathering. There's going to be the 12 tribes that are born from him. So this is a momentous event. And in this event, looking back, Israel, it says, doesn't eat, basically, I'm not sure, is it called the sciatic nerve that runs back through the hip? And so with kosher meat, you will never be served meat from the hind part of the animal, even if it is a clean animal. You will not be served, say, rump roast, because it comes from the back of the animal, and it increases the expense of the butchering process in order to remove that nerve out of the cow. And so they do different things with that part of the cow, but in terms of what would come to your table if you'll go to a kosher butcher and see what's offered, going to be a lot of brisket. You're going to see things like shoulder roast, ribeyes, those sorts of cuts, but not the back part of the cow. And we can see where this custom originated because the Torah actually records the tradition that from this point on, that Israel would not eat the hind part, or at least the immediate nerve area of the animal. It would be either butchered out, which I'm sure they did back in those days. They probably used as much of it as they possibly could. But in our time, sometimes our process, we churn things out so quickly that it actually costs more in labor than it would be to actually extract that part of the cow. So within the seed of the Torah itself, it talks about a tradition. And the tradition is based in the Torah. So the seed is in the Torah. It's not a tare. It's not a weed. It doesn't say that because the pagans did it this way, that Israel decided to do it this way to this day. It's to commemorate this event. So it's a good tradition. It identifies Israel. Is basically what the passage is saying. How can you identify someone from Israel? Well, if you saw that this person never ate from the back end of the animal, that would be one clue, because a tradition developed out of it. So that's the kind of mini lesson that I really didn't have time to get in this morning, but I wanted to show you that because this portion really does help us later as we're trying to divide that word of truth and do like Yeshua did, to look at a tradition and to judge it according to set criteria: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. If the seed is in the Torah, if it meets the criteria of justice, mercy, and faithfulness, if it's not self-focused, then you have a fine tradition. Just like the difference between the tax collector and the Pharisee who were praying. Both were using Jewish traditions. The extra fasting was common in the first century, that the Pharisee says, well, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I have. The fasting is a tradition. The giving tithes of all I had is something that the Pharisees might do, but it's not required. But the key was in how it was stated. He says he prayed to himself. The tax collector, on the other hand, is practicing two other traditions. He beats himself on the breast as he repents, and he won't look up, which is what you do during the vidui. It's called the putting down of the head. You don't look up during that process of repentance. But in that case, the tradition actually helped the tax collector. It did what it was supposed to do. It was to be the vehicle for repentance. For the Pharisee, it didn't function because his heart was wrong. So the problem Yeshua was pointing out is not in their traditions. Those are the vehicles. And that's to help wake up your heart. And if it doesn't wake up your heart, then neither the Torah nor the tradition are doing you much good at that point. You can't put it on rocky soil. It just doesn't work. So let's get into the portion. In chapter 33, well, and actually before that, because it's kind of split between the two places. It says in 32:8, Jacob was greatly frightened. In his anxiety, he divided the people with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into two camps, thinking if Esau comes to one camp and attacks it, the other camp may yet escape. Right? This is the first division. And if you've had time to read through the entire Torah portion this week, you'll see that this Torah portion is full of divisions and separations. It's teaching a principle of division and separation. In fact, at the end of it, Esau and Jacob are still separated. It looks for a moment as though they're going to get back together, and then, as it turns out, they just go their separate ways. And you're thinking, yes, because there's no way that would have turned out well had they gotten back together. And sometimes separation is a good thing. Sometimes it's an abomination. The seventh abomination of the wicked lamp is one who separates brothers. Well, what does that mean? I think the progression we can see is that brothers are people of like kind and like mind. It's not necessarily your physical family, because Yeshua said, who are my mother and my brother and my sisters? It's those who do the will of the Father who sent me. So who is your brother? It's the one who does the will of the Father. So that separation of true brothers, they might be physically separated, but we can see, nevertheless, there's been a reconciliation in their relationship. They're never going to be twins in the traditional sense. You usually see twins being very close, having a very close relationship. In this case, it's just the opposite. They're as different as two twins could be, but the relationship has had at least a partial repair, an agreement to go our separate ways, but yet be brothers. And then later we know they came back together to bury Isaac. Just like Ishmael and Isaac buried Abraham, then you'll see that same pattern with Esau and Jacob. They do get back together when they bury their father. So that was the first division of the family. And we can see it's because Jacob is planning a way of escape. He's got two camps here, and he says, well, if one falls, the other one might be okay. And then over in chapter 33, he does it again, but he makes even more divisions. It says, looking up, Jacob saw Esau coming, accompanied by 400 men. He divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two maids, putting the maids and their children first, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. Then he himself went on ahead and bowed low to the ground 7 times until he was near his brother. And at that point, we saw they greeted one another, they embraced, they kissed, they cried, they had their little family reunion. But what I wanted to look at here was, okay, he's already divided the camp twice for purposes of, he's basically planning to fail at that point. He's making provision for failure. If this El Shaddai doesn't show up, then here's my plan. Just in case. It's like, okay, I have faith, but just in case, here's plan B. You know, God's always plan A, but if God doesn't show up in the situation, then I've got a plan B. And it sounds funny, but I think we've all done that from time to time. We would love to see a miracle. But if in case it doesn't, here's plan B. In chapter 3, we see it's hard to tell whether he's got 3 divisions here or 4. I would guess 4 by mother and child. But again, it looks like he's showing favoritism, because the ones who would be in the greatest danger would be the concubines and the children of the concubines, and then his favorite wife and son last. So maybe if they saw things weren't going well, they would have time to escape. But as it turns out, there was this reconciliation, and Esau asks a question that you'll see several times in Scripture. In verse 5, 33:5, he says, "Who are these?" That's a phrase that keeps popping up. Who are these? Remember later when Jacob blesses Joseph's sons, it's not like he doesn't know who they are. He's requested to see them. So when Joseph walks in with his 2 sons, why would Jacob say, "Who are these?" Why would Esau say, "Who are these?" And later, Rachel, weeping for her children, in prophecy says, "Who are these? Where did these come from?" So we know it's a prophetic statement. Who are these? In this case, Jacob answers the question and answers the prophecy question. He says, "The children with whom God has favored your servant." So when you see that question, who are these? It's the children. And you say, well, isn't that obvious? Now think about it. The increase, the promise that was made to Abraham, that was passed down to Isaac, that now has been passed on to Jacob. And Jacob says, these are the children with whom God has favored your servant. These are the children. These are the children of promise. These were the ones that were spoken about. These are signs of the covenant. And later when Jacob asked Joseph, who are these? Because you've got basically 2 Egyptian children who would not have an Israelite identity. They would have looked like Joseph, who looks like an Egyptian. They would have been reared in Egypt. They would not probably have known Hebrew as their first language. I'm sure Joseph taught it to them because we know those tribes attached to Israel. But it would have been harder for them to identify as children of Israel because they really were children of Egypt, being children of Joseph. And Jacob says, who are these? Well, it's Ephraim and Manasseh. They may not look like Israelites. Maybe their accents aren't very Hebrew, but these are the children. They are still part of the covenant, children of promise. And later when Rachel says, remember Rachel weeping for her children? She says, who are these? Where did these come from? Who are these flying like doves to their lattices? She can't recognize them. Kind of like Jacob and Ephraim and Manasseh. Who are these? I don't get it. It's prophecy because there are children being gathered. Rachel's children are being gathered. They just don't look Hebrew. They don't look Israelite, but they're the children of the promise. And that's good news, is that not everyone who is Israel looks like Israel at first glance. Remember Jacob's speckled, streaked, and spotted goats and sheep? Well, there's lots of speckles out here, and we don't necessarily look like, the little Israelite down the street. But Rachel says they're flying home. They're flying like doves to the lattices. They're like homing pigeons. They finally figured out where Israel is. So these are the children of the promise. And in that reversal, it looks like it would have been the children of the concubines who would have had the honor of being introduced first to Esau. So sometimes those who are first are last, and those who are last are first. Well, in this case, Jacob was trying to protect his most prized, but the greatest honor ended up going to the children of the concubine. Because remember, he always brought out the runts last, like David. Like, well, we got one more out tending the sheep. He's the runt of the litter. And so in that reversal, we can see that somehow, no matter how it goes, the Holy One has a way of equalizing things in spite of us. He figures out how to make things fair. He knows how to honor those to whom honor is due. So what I wanted to do now is look at the parable of the talents, which was listed in the suggested additional study text for the lesson. And it's Matthew 25:14. Matthew 25:14. And this is a parable. And remember, a parable, mashal. And what a parable does, it teaches a spiritual principle with human beings. That's how it works. So Yeshua is teaching a spiritual principle. He says, for it is just like a man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To one, he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. Immediately, the one who received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more. Notice the time. It says immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded them and gained 5 more. So he doubled the money. It says in the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. That tells you he also went immediately. he found some way, some trade, some investment, and doubled the money. But the third one reacts differently. It says, but he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. So after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I've gained 5 more. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things, and I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Also, the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I've gained 2 more. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things, and I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one also who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said to him, you wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I would reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore, take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have will be taken away. Throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now that sounds pretty harsh, but the key there is that he said, to the one who doesn't have, take away even what he does have. Well, if he doesn't have anything, how can he have anything? What he did have was what was given to him. It was his to manage. But his response was different. And that's why I put it in the context of this Torah portion. If you were the one who received 1, how would you feel if, say, I don't know if they were standing in a line and they could each see what the other was doing? Like, okay, he's called all 3 of us in the office here. He gives this guy 10. He gives this guy 2, and I get 1. What would instantly start? A feeling of inferiority, a feeling of being unfairly treated, a feeling of competition. See, that's what happens when we start comparing ourselves to other people in the kingdom, in the master's kingdom. When we start looking around and taking account of what other people have, then we will start comparing. That's a competitiveness that we can assign to the beast of the field. The beast is a perpetual competitor. And in every generation, that beast has been fed. If not literally on the hunting fields or the killing fields of war, then in sports. Sports go all the way back farther than the Colosseums of Rome. If we can't compete any other way, then we'll make up games so that we can compete with one another. But this sort of mindset doesn't have any place in the kingdom. It's not a competition against someone else. Just like Cain and Abel, it wasn't an offering competition. The only competition is with yourself. There's no one else to compare yourself to except Yeshua. So if Cain and Abel, they're both bringing in an offering, and Abel brings in the first of his flocks, but Cain only brings the fruit of the ground, then he loses. That's what he feels. He doesn't feel the sense that, well, the reason that I didn't get any respect here was because I chose to keep the best for myself. I kept something in reserve for myself. I didn't give the best I had. Maybe he went and buried it. Who knows what he did with the first fruits, but he didn't offer it. And so instead of listening to what Elohim says, who says, you know what to do, if you'll just do what you know to do, then it will be respected. He chooses to compare himself to Abel. It's a spirit of competition. And when we start comparing ourselves to other people in the kingdom, we will develop an inferiority complex. Because no matter how much Torah you think you know, or what a great praise and worship leader you are, or whatever other talents there might be in the kingdom, trust me, there's someone out there who can do it better than you. So if you get into comparing yourself to others, very soon you're going to be disappointed, and then you're not going to like the results. Your countenance will fall, and it'll take away your motivation, which is with this parable of the servants. You can see that the one who received the one, it's like his countenance does fall. And so instead of immediately going out and looking for a way to trade up, he drags his feet out there and finds a hole to dig. And even that one thing that he has been given, he buries it. So it's as if he never had it. What was the point of giving him the talent if he wasn't going to do anything with it? He didn't have to give him anything at all. He had to give him no opportunities whatsoever, and he would have got the same thing back. But the wicked, lazy servant doesn't see it that way. He just says, well, I'll store it here for you till you get back. And he's actually making some pretty serious accusations of the master. He's saying, you want me to go do the work. You're not doing the work. I'm going to go do the work for you, but you're going to come and you're going to reap the interest on the work that I do for you. You can see he's got all kinds of problems about the way that he's processing this transaction. And I believe, the root of it might have been in that one talent. You didn't even give me a chance. Why did you place me where you placed me? Why didn't you give me more gifts than so-and-so? Why can't I play the guitar? Why can't I be Paul Wilbur? There's all sorts of things we can look at and say, why can't I be like that person? Why didn't you give me more talent? Why didn't you give me a nicer appearance? Why wasn't I born into a family that could give me more advantages in education and nurturing and all this stuff? Well, the first two servants didn't ask those questions. See, all three were slaves. There was no difference in the three slaves in terms of qualification, but there was a huge difference in their motivation, in the attitude in which they received what they were given. Because if you think about it, the one who received 2 didn't get much more than the one who received 1. Just a little bit more. There was still a huge gap between 2 and 10. And so the one who received 2 could have adopted the same attitude. Well, you're not even giving me a good start here. If you had given me 10, then I could do a whole lot more. It'd be a lot easier. But see, if I go out and I invest 2 and I lose 2, I've got nothing. The guy who's got 10 could go invest 2 and he's still got 8 to work with. It's how you frame the situation sometimes. And so when you feel like, well, if the Father has a plan, why did he plan to give me so little? And what am I supposed to do with this little bit that I have? We don't all have the advantages. We don't all have a great education. We can't all speak or read Hebrew. We can't all write. We can't all be teachers. We can't all be praise and worship leaders. We can't all be congregational leaders. There's all kinds of gifts within the body. And on the surface, it looks like some have more. But maybe it's just on the surface. Because maybe even if it looks as though some were preferred over others, like with these children, it seemed to be those who were least favored who were given the greatest honor in the end. So it's the attitude. And you can almost see this in the children as we grow up, as they grow up and we hear their stories, we can see that there is some bitterness against their father because of Joseph, because of this practice. So there's two different ways I think we could look at this. It's the Father in heaven who chooses what gifts he gives us, whether it's many or whether it's a few. But it's entirely up to us whether we double the money, whether he gives us 1 or whether he gives us 10. If we will be diligent with what he gives us, then we're still called good and faithful servants. We're still brought into the kingdom. And in fact, it looks to me like there's going to be people out there who do nothing with the talent he gave them. And it doesn't go to waste because in the kingdom, he turns around and he gives theirs to those who were diligent. You know, we pray in the daily prayer, or in Shabbat, grant us our portion in your Torah. Our portion is to study Torah. And that's where I don't mind asking for a big helping. I want as much as you can put on my plate that won't slide out of my brain and out of my heart. I'll take every bit you want to give me, and I guarantee you I will study it. I will be diligent with it. I will try to apply it. I will try to do good with it. And when you return, I will have as much as I can possibly have to hand back to you and say, thank you for the loan. Because see, like the one with the 1 talent, it wasn't his anyway. It was the master's talent. So whatever he gives us, it's already his anyway. If he gives you 10, it's his. If he gives you 1, it's his. If he gives you 2, it's his. But he's willing to share the reward of it. But as I say, our portion in your Torah. But there's a lot of people, I don't know if they were given 10. I don't know if they were given 1. I don't know if they were given 2. But everyone has a portion in the Torah. And if they don't want theirs, I'll take it. I'll take it. I can't imagine burying the gift of not just reading his word, but learning how to apply it in your life. And there are a lot of people who never do that. They never bothered to read the word, and it's a gift. There's no excuse for at least any American not to study the word. I mean, if you need a Bible, go to the local hotel room. You'll get a free one. You can go online and read the Bible for free. Look, you can walk into any church and they've got a stack of Bibles people have left behind. Talk about being left behind. They don't even remember to take their Bibles home because they're not reading their Bibles at home. You can walk into just about any church and ask, hey, do you have any spare Bibles? And they'll give you more than you want. So our portion is in the Torah, and then investing it. We can't just read it and bury it and hide it in there where nobody can see it. We have to keep doubling the money, doubling that investment, working in His Word, so that maybe you've been through one Torah cycle and you've got one portion in the Torah. Okay, this year, let's double that. And next year, let's add some more interest on that. Let's keep learning, because every year what you'll find is you'll find something else in that Torah portion you didn't see there before. But because you just keep trading up in that study, before you know it, you've got riches of the kingdom, and you know more than the pastor down at the local church that gave you the Bible. Because you kept studying, you kept researching, you were diligent with that talent that He gave you. And you didn't stand there and decide to develop an inferiority complex about it. Well, so-and-so is brilliant. I wish I could teach Torah like so-and-so. Don't compare yourself to other people. Compare yourself to you. Yesterday, last year. Have you grown in the talent that He's given you? Have you grown in the word that He gave you? Do you not just understand more, but are you doing more? That great myth is that deeds don't matter. Well, we know it's a myth, because let's go to James, the book of James. And it's chapter 2. And in the first parable, it deals with the way we respond when it looks like things are unfair. But in the book of James, he goes on to help us not to do that to other people, because here's what we can be sure of. If the Father chooses to give us 10, it's because He knows what we can do with 10. If He chooses to give us 2, it's because He knows what we'll do with 2. If He chooses to give us 1, He probably already knows what we'll do with 1. But the same person with 1 could have come back and given him 2. If the attitude had been different, he also had the potential to double the money. But this doesn't give us license to mistreat other people, to show attitudes of personal favoritism. And that's what Jacob did. He showed favoritism, and that created an ongoing problem within the family. Now, it's not that the Holy One didn't use that very problem to bring salvation to Israel. But when you leave a debris field of broken relationships, grudges, and so forth behind you, we can always circle back and say, had Jacob chosen differently, couldn't he have also provided salvation to Israel without all the emotional damage? Because if we're not even supposed to cause suffering to a donkey, then why in the world would we purposely do it to other people? So James says, my brothers, don't hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who is wearing fine clothes and say, hey, you sit here in the good place, and you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit over here by my footstool. Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives. Listen, my beloved, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court? Don't they blaspheme the fair name by which you've been called? If, however, you are fulfilling the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law, the whole Torah, and stumbles in one, he has become guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do commit murder, you've become a transgressor of the law. So speak and act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be merciless to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. So then he goes on to explain what he's talking about. He's saying you can't just study the Torah, which is founded on justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Those three things, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. If we're showing favoritism to certain people because, well, in his example, it's not just that the people are rich, they also have influence. And people will do that. They will attach themselves to other people whom they believe have influence, which gives them more social power. It's still a type of hunting field. But we have to put works with our faith when it comes to the Torah, because James is calling it a Torah of liberty. And he says, what use is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, and yet you don't give them what's necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But some will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works. I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. He's referring to the Shema here, like the statement of faith that you would make at least twice a day. Okay, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. So James is bringing up a point here, which is about our friends. I don't want to say our friends, our favorites. They may not even be our friends, but we have our favorites. And we have to be really careful, especially in a congregation. If we have a fellowship of believers like James is talking about, we always have those people that are easier to get along with. And we may form closer relationships with those people. Maybe we have children that play together. Maybe we live closer to one another. We may just be a good fit. There's people you get along with, people you don't. But it does not give you permission to ignore or to mistreat those with whom you're not good friends. If they're part of your fellowship, it doesn't matter what their social standing is. It doesn't matter whether they're making minimum wage or they're pulling down 6 figures a year. Torah says that doesn't matter. And that's what James is saying. Their social worth, their economic worth is only the way the world looks at those people. But in a fellowship of believers, we treat one another equally. We don't ignore someone because their circumstances are not as good as ours. And like I said, it doesn't mean that you can't have best friends. Everybody has besties. But we don't have permission to look down on others. I said, there's 2 points here. In the parable, it's how we with our heart deal with feeling as though maybe we didn't get as much as the next person. But when we become the judge, and James makes that statement, he says, if you're behaving this way, then aren't you becoming the judge? Aren't you judging this person's value? Where do you get permission to judge another human being's value? You don't. Just because they don't have new clothes or new shoes, that's not what we judge. We judge them equally. They're all part of the family. Whether you're, like with Jacob, the child of the concubine, or you're the son of Rachel, you're all part of Israel. And the gates are, sounds like, equally distant. And Revelation, they don't have a smaller gate for Asher or Naphtali and a bigger gate for Judah. The gates are the same, all 12 tribes, equidistant on 4 sides. And so in our congregations, even though we will spend more time with some than others, it's important that, especially if they might be a one-talent person, it's important that we make that one-talent person feel as though he or she can double that talent in the kingdom, that they don't see being poor or being lacking education, whatever that may be, that they don't feel that deficiency so strongly that they would go bury that and say, there's no hope for me. I'll never be as smart as so-and-so. I'll never sing as well as so-and-so. I'll never be able to organize an event like so-and-so. We have to find ways to include those people. James says it's incumbent upon us to make even the poorest member of our fellowship feel as though that one talent is the most valuable talent of all. You have to catch them doing something commendable and make them feel their worth within the body of Messiah. Now, you can't go invest that talent for them. He didn't give you their talent. He may later, if they go bury it. We don't want that to happen. But in terms of fairness, we can see that later the Torah corrects this behavior that Jacob is displaying, where he shows favoritism with the wives and the children. Later, the Torah corrects this and says, don't marry sisters. That's a mistake, because one's going to be favored and one's going to be unloved. It's not the Father's will that in a congregation some be favored while others are unloved, because it leads to problems. It leads to resentments. It leads to stray sheep. Remember Joseph out blundering in the field? I mean, that's almost literally what that Hebrew word means. He was out blundering, looking for his brothers who did not want to be found. Have you ever hid from your little brother or sister so they wouldn't find you? You didn't want to be bothered. Well, that can happen in a fellowship. You know, and I'm not saying that's easy, but there are those, they just don't come in with as many gifts into the fellowship as others. And those are the ones you need to invite to Shabbat dinner. Those are the ones you need to ask them, how was your week? You need to be sure they get a hug at Shabbat service. You don't go hug all your favorite people and not greet those who are, maybe they forgot to take that Shabbat bath, right? Within the congregation, everybody's important. And that one talent not invested could be a real key for the congregation. Because if that 10 talent person is doing his or her 10 talent work, it's still not the same talent that the one talent person had. That one unique opportunity they had could have been a turning point for that congregation, because that 10 talent person didn't have that one. You might be a one talent person, but you might have the key that turns the whole thing. I might have 10 keys over here, but none of them fit that lock. And so within the body of Messiah, everyone is important. And the Torah, it goes back and it corrects Jacob and says, hey, you can't favor a younger son and not give the firstborn son his double portion. You can't do that. So did he take this situation and make some good things out of it? Sure. But would it have been a lot less rocky without unduly favoring wives and sons? And would there have been a lot less hurt feelings? So, in summary, basically I'm saying we could have two problems. Number one, I could be a person that just picks up offense. I feel like I'm being overlooked. I feel like I'm not being treated fairly. I feel like nobody listens to me. I feel like no matter what I do, nobody's going to notice. That's my problem. That's me picking up the bait of offense. But there's another side. And it says, I don't have permission to mistreat a one talent person, because I have to recognize that that one talent is as critical to my family and Messiah as the one who has 10 or 2 or 8 or 3. It doesn't matter. And in fact, I wouldn't get into trying to figure out who has how many talents. Because in the kingdom, that role reversal, like you saw with the concubine sons, all of a sudden now they're at the front of the line. So sometimes the people we think that are at the back of the line, in his kingdom, they're at the front. And that's the whole sum of the Torah, really. Love your neighbor as yourself. Like James is saying, you know the Shema? Good boy, good girl, Shema Yisrael. But if you're going to Shema Yisrael, it means that we have to lend value to every member of our community. And we have to find ways to include them. We have to find ways, if we already know that it's human to pick up an offense, then we can't stop it if someone chooses to take up offense. But there's probably a lot of things we can do to let them know that they are valued, for they don't need to pick up the offense and run. Because in hindsight, isn't there a debris field of offense in the Hebrew roots movement? Just look behind you and you'll see it. You'll see a lot of baggage out there in the wilderness. scattered all over the place. You'll see people go from congregation to congregation, congregation. You'll see those offended people full of bitterness and sourness. They're full of chametz. They're sour against this. They're sour against that. I don't know how they keep Passover with so much sourness. But part of that we can't control. But what if at the beginning of that journey, before that person felt rejected, not valued, unimportant, unliked, what if somebody had made that person his or her project? What if you had taken the seed of the word and done what James said and invested it in that person? What if that person was the place you were supposed to invest it in? So that you could help that person to become more healthy and to see his or her own value within the congregation. See, you don't have to go to China or Africa to sow a seed. You can sow that seed in the person sitting next to you. And in some cases, we have a lot of people who don't have a local fellowship. Where they live, they just don't have access. Maybe this class is the only group thing they do with anyone. You got a chat box over there. If somebody's put on your heart, go to the chat box, communicate with them. Say, hey, would you mind if I sent you an email? Because I don't share your emails with each other, just in case. You don't want to somebody get hacked and then you start getting the email. But if you choose, if you pray and say, Father, show me someone in this class that needs a pen pal, needs a spiritual pen pal, that needs a word of encouragement. You can chat and you can actually isolate it right now. Mine says everyone, but I can click on that and it'll pull up every person's name right now who's online, who's active. And I can match it up with the panel. I think you're seeing the same thing I do. You can isolate that person and send that person a message. And you may not want to be pen pals. Just say, hey, let me introduce myself. I live in such and such place. Greetings. We can sow our seed in one another. Let's see, I'm going to stop the recording here.